Welcome back to the Photography Show TV studio, where I'm joined by two guests now, with Mike from Panasonic and Dan from Atomos. What I want to talk to you about, gents, if I can, is HDR. Now, that's a term that's certainly come into the consumer consciousness over the last 3 or 4 years with the smartphone photography, videography, and also with the TVs, 4K, Ultra HD, HDR, and so on. When it comes to still photography, I'm not sure I'm hearing it in the same conversations. Dan, I know you've got quite strong opinions on this, so tell me where you think we are with HDR and stills at the moment.
Well, at the moment, right up until about this week, when you've been able to buy the brand new Panasonic S1, frankly, we've been nowhere because there's not been an easy way for anybody shooting a still to show their picture in what we would say is true HDR, or in Panasonic terminology, HLG HDR. So even though you might have a HDR television, when you connect or show your still photo on it, it's not actually showing it in HDR. It might be a nice looking picture, but it's not HDR. And the reason for that is there's been no simple mechanism by which you could just take a picture on a camera, connect it to your TV, and see it using that HDR. Now, photographers go, well, we've had HDR forever. Well, what photographers talk about when they say HDR is actually something very different to what we're talking about here. It's almost like they should have different names, but unfortunately the video industry has already chosen to call it HDR. So what we're not talking about is taking multiple pictures and stacking the images up and basically cramming the dynamic range of a wide dynamic range scene, perhaps with the sky and shadows and everything else, into a limited range output. So very simply, your printed paper or your old television or your monitor was only capable of showing you so much dynamic range, so many stops of dynamic range, and we all know the only way to fix that in photography is to start dodging and burning, going to darkroom techniques, stacking and doing HDR. Those are all the workarounds, because you couldn't actually fit everything from a really bright sky into a deep shadow into the one picture. And HDR for video was designed as a fix for video, for movies, to fix that exact problem. And then, funnily enough, the photography world didn't do anything about it for quite a long time, 3 or 4 years, and finally now. Until now.
Now, Mike, this is where you come into the conversation, because in my hand just here is the brand new, this is the S1, and there's the S1R as well. This is a full frame mirrorless camera system from your good selves, but what we're talking about here in particular is the ability to get HDR stills out of here. So tell me what's new, tell me what's enabling that, and how, using the Atomos kit on top and also going out, I'm sure, to the Panasonic TVs as well, we're actually able to get HDR stills visible for the first time.
So again, as Dan talked about earlier, in terms of terminology, what we've dubbed it within the cameras is HLG, which is sort of a terminology used in video again, called hybrid log gamma, and it's about improving the dynamic range of a camera to get the most possible detail from highlight to shadow. Now, at the moment, the S1 and S1R are the only still cameras that are able to capture this, and what we're actually doing is taking all of the data but using a processing power within the camera to make sure that is easily viewable. And thanks to the work we do with the guys at Atomos and the guys in our TV department, we're actually able to highlight and show the true dynamic range of the sensor from the deepest shadow to the brightest highlight and capture as much detail as possible.
And is that a lot of extra processing? When you mentioned processing there, does that mean that you're taking the raw image from the sensor and then sticking it through an image processor in order to make those darks darker and the lights lighter?
It's just about utilizing all of the data we're able to capture in the sensor. So it's not about so much about the processing of the image, but it's about utilizing the processing power the camera has to capture as much data from the sensor as we can.
Okay, and so obviously going from a Panasonic camera into a Panasonic TV, that's going to be good. But Atomos is part of the conversation, isn't it, Dan? So talk to me about your support for HDR and HDR stills and video.
So to explain, whilst this shoots HDR, both the EVF and the LCD screen on the back can't show HDR. And actually, pretty obvious, this is a lot brighter than the screen here. But not only that, the colours are punchier, they're richer. You are seeing more into the shadows, more in the highlights than you can ever see on these displays here. Now you can hypothesize in the future that may change, but right now the S1 and the S1R, first cameras to do it, can't show that full HDR. And there may be circumstances where the photographer really needs to or wants to see that HDR in the field, probably more appropriately in the studio, where a client is looking at it, whereas you don't want to guess what the picture is going to look like. You really want to show what that picture is going to look like, and right there as you're shooting, not when you get home or plugging into a big TV. So landscapes as well, perhaps people who are used to going up mountains with plate cameras, this isn't actually that big compared to a plate camera. They'll be able to look at a landscape scene, which is typically one of those problematic scenes for cameras and exposures and capturing the range, and they'll be able to fully evaluate, looking at it in real time and see detail in the shadows, detail in the highlights, know how to adjust the exposure. They may still need a filter. How does that filter affect that HDR image? Let's see it in real time, not guess it.
I have to say, just looking at this camera and looking at the viewfinder here, and also looking at the Atomos kit on top, I'm sure that your EVF and the viewfinder on the back of the S1 are incredible, are very, very good. But the colours that I'm seeing on the Atomos Ninja on top here, I would like to walk around that and compose my images with this, particularly if I was looking for that burst of colour, or it's not just saturation, it's making sure that I am getting all of those lights and darks, and just pointing it around the studio here and looking to the distance, you can see the difference there.
And importantly, it's also what you're going to see. It's really close to what you're going to see on a big HDR television. It's a very accurate representation of what it will be when you plug it into your TV at home and sit and look at it with your family, friends, clients, whatever.
Where is this going to go next? Because obviously, we're talking about Atomos and Panasonic are very chummy and making this beautiful thing in my hands happen. But do you see this being part of a bit of a broader move in the industry? Do you think some of your competitors are going to start to play catch up and start to try and have similar conversations with their customers?
And I think at the end of the day, it's about who owns the technology. We obviously have input and output through our displays, our TVs, our screens, and our input through the cameras. So we have the workflow and we understand that technology. So it's about whether other manufacturers have that inherent technology and that ability to do so. Obviously, we can't comment on what our competitors are up to. What we're focusing on is making sure that we're giving the user the best possible experience. During our pre-chat, we were talking about the color gamuts for RGB and Adobe RGB and how they're changing. We've now taken the step to actually broaden the range of the color gamut that the camera can actually capture and therefore output, but we need a dedicated device such as the Atomos devices to be able to see that output effectively.
And it's a pretty fundamental change in photography, I think. That's what I'm really keen to stress. It's going to take a recalibration, a brain recalibration for a lot of photographers, and probably consumers as well. But you're sitting there looking at it. I think we can all agree it's a very pleasing image to look at. It's very real, whether you like real or not. There's a whole debate about.
Of course, but at the end of the day, you're capturing an awful lot of clarity, awful lot of fidelity in the sensor there that gives you those options in post, however you choose to display that and output it. Listen, Mike, Dan, thank you very much indeed for chatting us through a really interesting combination of technologies here, and I look forward to having an individual play with both of those later on. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.